They didn't change the law. They changed the definition of threat. That's what the Alex Pretti case quietly introduced. A man is dead, and the justification didn't hinge on what he did in those final moments. It hinged on what he carried. In the aftermath of the Minneapolis shooting, officials didn't wait to reconstruct actions. They focused on equipment. An extra magazine was elevated from neutral gear into evidence of nefarious intent. That framing matters because it flips the burden instantly. If preparedness signals danger, then innocence is no longer presumed when law enforcement arrives. The moment a badge appears, readiness becomes suspicion. And for anyone who carries lawfully, that changes the risk calculation in ways no statute ever announced. This wasn't framed as an exception. It was presented as logic, calm, procedural, almost obvious. And that's what makes it dangerous. When the story centers on gear instead of behavior, the outcome starts feeling predetermined. But here's the detail that forces you to stay with this. This wasn't a reaction in isolation. It was coordinated, deliberate, and aimed at setting a precedent that reaches far beyond one shooting. What followed made that coordination impossible to miss. The response didn't drift out in fragments or conflicting statements. It arrived unified, fast, and disciplined. Senior officials moved almost in lockstep, delivering the same emphasis across interviews and appearances. The details they chose to highlight were remarkably consistent. Not the unfolding of events, not the uncertainties, the gear. Only a portion of the story was allowed to surface, just enough to establish tone. The public wasn't walked through a timeline. They were given a character assessment, and that assessment rested heavily on the idea that Alex Pretti's equipment revealed who he really was before anything else could be examined. That's a familiar tactic. When facts are incomplete, framing becomes decisive. Once a narrative is anchored early, later details don't change minds. They get absorbed, reinterpreted, dismissed if they don't fit. The question stops being what happened and becomes, why would someone be prepared like that? This is where the issue stops being about a single incident. It starts looking like part of a larger pattern, one where interpretation outruns investigation. And once that pattern forms, it raises a harder question than any official statement wants to answer. If preparedness can be framed as intent, what does that turn every future encounter into by default? The strongest claim embedded in this response is also the most consequential. That approaching law enforcement while armed creates a high likelihood that lethal force is legally justified. That line wasn't buried. It was stated plainly as if it were a neutral observation rather than a warning. And once it's said out loud, it changes how every prior protection is understood. Here's what that does. It reframes lawful carry from a right into a risk multiplier. The permit doesn't shield you. It heightens the danger. The moment an encounter begins, legality no longer stabilizes the situation, it destabilizes it. The justification isn't built around what you intend to do, but what might be inferred about you before you act. That's not abstract, it's operational. If the presence of a weapon alone can tip the scale toward lethal force, then behavior becomes secondary. Commands, compliance, confusion, context, all of it gets compressed into a single calculation made under stress. And that calculation is being pre-validated after the fact. Notice what's missing from that logic. There's no meaningful threshold, no requirement that a weapon be drawn, no emphasis on distance or time, just presence. Once that becomes enough, the justification is no longer exceptional, it's portable, and that's when a statement stops being commentary and starts functioning like doctrine. From there, escalation doesn't arrive as chaos, it arrives as routine. The idea that armed presence itself creates danger starts getting treated as settled wisdom, not a controversial claim. What once required extraordinary justification begins to sound like standard procedure. The threshold doesn't rise, it drops. You've seen this pattern before, even if it wasn't labeled this way. An unusual response gets defended, the defense gets repeated, the repetition makes it feel normal, and once it's normal, it stops being interrogated. In this case, the normalization isn't about tactics, it's about expectations. Officers are taught what will be backed, citizens are taught what won't. Here's where the story flips. When the system treats lawful behavior as inherently destabilizing, it incentivizes speed over clarity. The pressure is no longer to understand the moment, but to resolve it before uncertainty grows. That's how margins disappear, not through malice, but through accepted practice. What's being normalized here isn't force. It's inevitability. The idea that once certain conditions exist, outcomes are pre-written. And when that mindset takes hold, every future encounter quietly inherits it. At that point, the escalation is complete. Not because anything changed overnight, but because something that should never feel ordinary just did. The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore once words and actions are placed side by side. Publicly, the administration presents itself as a defender of gun rights. The language is familiar: support for lawful ownership, respect for the Constitution. But in this case, the operational message pointed in the opposite direction. The equipment Alex Pretti carried was treated not as protected property, but as retroactive justification. That's the pivot that changes how everything reads. A right that exists in theory is being used against the person exercising it in practice. The same gear that signals responsibility in one context becomes evidence of threat in another. Nothing about the object changed. Only the narrative around it did. This is the line that permanently alters perception. When the state can praise a right while punishing its exercise, the right becomes conditional without ever being revoked. Compliance doesn't protect you, it exposes you. And once that logic is accepted, the contradiction stops needing explanation. Notice how clean the transition is. No policy announcement, no formal reversal, just a quiet shift in how outcomes are defended after the fact. That's what makes it effective. It avoids debate by arriving already normalized. At that point, the issue stops being about consistency. It becomes about power deciding which version of the right applies in the moment that matters most. What comes next is a compression of pressure where multiple threads tighten at once. First, due process gets sidelined. Intent is inferred after the fact, based not on testimony or trial, but on equipment lists and narrative framing. Judgment arrives faster than verification, and it moves in one direction only. At the same time, an alternative story struggles to surface. The possibility that Alex Pretti was intervening, not escalating, that he believed he was helping, not threatening. That version never fully forms in public view, not because it's disproven, but because it's inconvenient. A hero narrative can't coexist with institutional error, so one of them has to go. Then there's the timing. The speed with which conclusions were broadcast left no room for uncertainty to breathe. The faster the explanation arrives, the harder it is to unwind. Each hour that passes locks the frame tighter. This is how control starts slipping. When multiple pressures stack, clarity collapses. The system moves to protect itself. The public struggles to understand what's real, and individuals are left guessing how their actions will be read in a moment of stress. So the question sharpens quickly. What happens if this continues? This is where it stops being abstract and starts landing in real life, because the impact of this logic isn't confined to federal statements or courtroom arguments. It shows up in the way ordinary people think through everyday moments. Moments where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen, a call for help, a tense situation unfolding nearby, a split-second choice about whether to get involved. When lawful carry becomes a liability, behavior changes quietly. You hesitate before stepping in, you delay before identifying yourself, you weigh how your presence might be interpreted, not by the person causing harm, but by the people arriving to stop it. Safety turns into a guessing game, and the rules aren't written down anywhere. This strips away ideology fast. It's not about loyalty or politics, it's about uncertainty, about knowing that compliance doesn't guarantee protection and preparedness doesn't guarantee understanding. The risk isn't theoretical, it's personal. And once that awareness sets in, trust erodes without noise. People don't protest, they withdraw, they disengage, they decide it's safer to do nothing than risk being misread in a moment that can't be undone. If this feels familiar to you, say so in the comments. comments, because recognition is part of what determines where this goes next. To make sense of how this persists, you have to look at incentives, not intentions. Systems don't primarily optimize for truth, they optimize for stability. When an incident threatens institutional legitimacy, the fastest way to restore balance is to narrow the explanation. Fewer variables, fewer questions, a cleaner story. Preparedness fits that need perfectly. It's visible, it's concrete, it photographs well. An extra magazine can be named, repeated, and remembered. It turns a chaotic human interaction into a simple narrative about risk management. And once that simplification is accepted, deeper scrutiny feels unnecessary, even disruptive. There's also leverage at work. When people believe outcomes are unavoidable, they stop demanding clarity. Fear shortens patience. Spectacle replaces analysis. The system doesn't have to convince everyone. It only has to exhaust them. Over time, uncertainty becomes normalized, and normalization becomes control. Here's the unsettling insight. Rights don't need to be revoked to be neutralized. They only need to be reframed as dangerous to exercise. When the cost of using a right becomes unpredictable, most people self-regulate without being told to. And once that mechanism is in place, the system doesn't need to push harder. It just waits to see how much behavior changes on its own. From here, the trajectory splits and neither outcome is locked in yet. One path is quiet acceptance. The framing holds, the precedent settles, and people adjust without being asked to. Lawful carry remains legal, but less visible, less exercised, less trusted in moments that matter. The system reads the absence of resistance as validation, and the standard hardens without ever being formally declared. The other path is friction, not outrage, not sudden reversal, but pressure that builds slowly. Questions resurface about what was emphasized and what was ignored. The assumption that preparedness equals threat starts to feel less convincing. Demands grow for clearer rules, clearer thresholds, clearer accountability in moments where seconds decide outcomes. That path doesn't move fast, but it doesn't fade either. What decides which path wins isn't a speech or a ruling, it's momentum. Right now, institutional certainty is moving faster than public understanding. And when that gap exists, the next decision tends to be reactive, not careful. You can feel it forming. This case isn't closing, it's setting conditions, and the direction it takes will shape how the next encounter is explained before it even happens. There's a single shift underneath all of this that makes the story hold together. The law didn't move, the assumption did, the assumption that lawful behavior would be interpreted in good faith during moments of uncertainty. Once that assumption breaks, rights don't disappear loudly, they thin out. They remain visible, but fragile, dependent on timing, perception, and who controls the explanation afterward. That's what the Alex Pretti case ultimately exposes. Not just a tragedy, but a template. A way to justify outcomes without reopening decisions. When preparedness is framed as danger, innocence is no longer the starting point. It's something you have to survive long enough to argue for. This story doesn't end here. It loops forward, because once a line moves quietly, it rarely stops. The next case will test it again. The one after that will push it further, just enough to feel familiar. If you want to understand where this is heading before it becomes obvious, stay with this channel. Subscribe, follow, and keep watching. The most important part of this story is what comes next and who notices it in time.